Hi, everyone. Once more, you can tell that we're here doing something a little different. I'm thrilled to be doing another interview. Today, we're going to be joined by Scott Hoffman, who some of you may know by his stage name of Baby Daddy. He was in the Scissor Sisters, and now he's entered into the realm of comics with outings such as WAG, Nostalgia, and now Worm Fusion. So, thank you so much for taking some time to come and chat with me about that today.
Thank you for having me. It's super exciting.
So, firstly, for the people who are not aware, we have it in the background, but perhaps they haven't heard of it. Can you tell us a little bit about Worm Fusion?
Sure, Warm Fusion is my take on a bit of body horror, a bit of seedy underground city life. It's about a future New York where everyone's sort of living in this trauma of a big event that has happened in the somewhat distant past. And we follow three different characters as it begins. We follow Vin Young, who is an escort working in the very especially freaky area of this future New York called the Blacklight District, and her friends are getting murdered. At the same time, we have Jared Hanover, a cop, a detective who's trying to figure out what's going on, but the rest of the city really doesn't want to give him the resources or attention to do that. And then we have of course, an evil biotech company. We got to put that in there called Prophetic, and a sort of father-son legacy where the son is trying to develop a new technology that helps repair missing skin or limbs, and that's where we begin.
Where did this idea come from for you?
Um, I think a lot of what I write and think about are ways to sort of make what's happening in the world a bit more elevated and extreme. I like looking to the future, not necessarily in a way that I predict will happen, but in a way that maybe I fear that will happen. So I was thinking a lot about toxicity. I'm thinking a lot
Mhm.
about climate change. I'm thinking a lot about um, the ways that we can kind of be terrible to each other, or in the reasons that we are terrible to each other. And I wonder sometimes if those things are inflamed by the kind of political landscape we live in and the social landscape we live in, the divisive landscape, and how we deal with other people in an extreme version of that, where we're kind of like surrounded by trauma. So I know that's kind of a general answer for you, but
Mhm.
that's sort of what got me thinking about this. And I also wanted to do something that was kind of fun and
Mhm.
had some fun sort of visual and action elements. I was doing a couple really heady comics before this for
Mhm.
Comixology, and this is kind of heady in its own way. But I wanted to add some of the kind of pulp that some of my favorite movies like Videodrome and maybe
Mhm.
John Carpenter's The Thing kind of like brought into my life.
Mhm. I did notice some of the Videodrome vibes. I'm always excited when somebody else also loves Videodrome. I'm like, "Yes, somebody else, long live the new Flash." So
Exactly. And it's a film that I think in particular has aged in a kind of interesting way. I mean, it's
Mhm.
it's a it's a it's a really prophetic film about the way we consume media and the way we consume other people's pain in a certain way. But
Mhm.
there's also an element of misogyny that I don't know that Cronenberg was necessarily insensitive to, but I did want to revisit what a piece like that would feel like in modern times with maybe a bit more a bit more empowerment um,
Mhm.
to the sort of female victims in these stories.
No, I noticed there are lots of different things that are being worked through in terms of how people were interacting with technologies in the story. Like one of the things I particularly noticed was how the detective Hanover, he's constantly censoring himself in his notes. Like he'll say something, then it's be like, "Oh, strike that." Like, was that something you were conscious of when you were writing it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it added a little bit of humor to me, which I liked. I like
Mhm.
the idea that we do sort of live in this world where we're expected to be, I guess you could say thematically in a lot of ways in this book, we're expected to be mechanical, and we're expected to do things the way that are sort of superior, superior technologies
Mhm.
can do, and we all are human and make mistakes. So I mean, I like that about him. I like that he's doing his best to live in a world that has those expectations, and I think everyone's doing their best in this world in a certain way to live up to these new standards. So it's funny. I really appreciate that you picked up on that. I think it's just funny little things that I that kind of keep me entertained as I'm writing, to
Mhm.
say that people have these little flaws and almost like uh self doubts that
Mhm.
make them a little more human to me.
'Cause I know that you came also from the world, not just of music, but of composition. Do you find that there's any similarities in terms of crafting music and crafting comics?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the best metaphor I can sort of look at, and I mean, it's the sort of truest one, is that the writer is really the songwriter, and the illustrator in these books really end up being the producer and director in a way of sort of what you're trying to do as an artist putting
Mhm.
together. So it's interesting for me not being involved with the second half, because as a band we were always sort of writing our songs and producing them and just making them on our computer at the same time and having that complete control. So in a funny way, um, it's collaborative in a really different way, where I'm less involved in how this actually looks and feels on the page, uh,
Mhm.
than how a final song would turn out. But I think what I do say is that Scissor Sisters was kind of an exercise in world building for us. It was about creating a sort of community of people, but also like a fantasy around what we
Mhm.
were creating. There was a New York we were living in. I mean, I think it's told really well on the cover of our first record. There was a sort of New York we were living in that was really vibrant and kind of almost like a dream we had been able to escape to, but at the same time we also wanted to escape the grittiness and the frustrations of New York and create
Mhm.
this escape around us. So um it's all kind of escapism, I guess you could say.
Mhm. So, how does that work when you're crafting something like this that is a bit more dystopian?
um Gosh, another interesting aspect when you ask the question about how it compares,
Yeah.
one of the huge differences in writing music and comics for me is that with music you would be able to go out on stage right after you've maybe even written a song and play it and feel the energy back and forth and maybe adjust sort of what you're doing based on that energy. We've had songs that we thought were incredible and big hits, and we play them and it's just completely dead in the room, and then other ones that were really unexpected, like Let's Have a Kiki, where we're just like,
Mhm.
we're just gonna make something really silly for us, and then, the first people we play it for are like, "Really? What's going on here?" So, I think for me, in the comics realm, there's a little bit more there's less of that playing back and forth, and not my need to sort of, provide a fun atmosphere for the people I'm performing to. I
Mhm.
picture someone that is really interested in what comic books can do when I'm writing, and the way they can be heady, and that inner voice that I really love writing so much. And
Mhm.
I think about books that people want to read over and over again, which is, I think a lost art to some degree, that are so full of ideas that you may miss them the first time around. So that may explain the approach in going towards this sort of darker world and this sort of like more insular world, something in the characters' heads a little bit. But at the same time, I do have some scripts and ideas that are a little more comedic and fun that just need to, you know, uh, uh, burrow into the light at some point.
So we were talking a bit before we got started about how you started off writing. So how did you come to be doing comic writing now?
Yeah, so Jake and I had actually started the band as a duo back when, in I think 2001 in New York, and he was in writing school, um, and he's an incredible writer. He's responsible for most of the lyrics for the band, and had written some crazy short stories and stuff I had read before as well. And I had finished a writing program at Columbia where I was in school. I'd really wanted to be a novel writer or write for film or something like that. And we both just kind of put those energies into making the band and creating this thing, and kind of came back around to it when the band decided to take a break. I was still doing music for a little while, producing and writing for other people. Sorry, it's a long-winded answer, but
No worries.
I ended up the pandemic hit. I was just like, you know what? I'm just burnt out on music. And Phil Jimenez, who you might know through your comics reading, incredible artist and friend of mine, suggested I finally give this a go and I try. And my problem was I had always wanted to be a writer, and I just didn't know how to kind of let go um, and maybe I didn't know some of the technical aspects of it. And he walked me through it. And we started a writing group together with another friend, Sam, who actually came up with some of the story beats with me because I wanted to collaborate on this one. And I just started writing, and it just started coming out, and I wrote a bunch of stuff, and it just felt like an extension of what I loved with the band, which was doing something that I felt real like a little naive about. I didn't really understand how it worked. And to me, that there's kind of like magic in that, I guess.
Do you have a history with liking and enjoying comics, or is it something that you're newer to?
Yeah, I've always been like a voracious reader. So I didn't really differentiate growing up with stuff like Stephen King and Clive Barker, and reading a lot of kind of dark, heady stuff, William Burroughs and stuff like that. But then at the same time, and maybe a little bit like I was reading Batman and stuff at that time, and then kind of like segued into Vertigo when Vertigo really became a dominant force. And I really wanted to know what was going on there because I felt like it connected so much with the kind of prose I was reading. So I dove really deep into that world, graphic novels, reading Alan Moore, reading Neil Gaiman, and just all the stuff again that like just felt like it connected in a way to the genre stuff I was reading, and some, great sci-fi stuff too, Transmetropolitan, all those books. They kind of came in a little later, but it was always kind of I would go out traveling with the band, and I'd fill my bag with a bunch of books, as would Jake. And, a good amount of them were graphic novels, or I'd go to Forbidden Planet when we were traveling and pick stuff up. I just always loved the weird underground things, whatever I could find.
So now that you're in it and like the ideas are flowing, like how many comics are you coming up with now?
Well, I've written probably about 12 full limited series scripts. So 3 of those have seen the light of day. Some of them probably never will. I'm pitching a longer form, which I'm really hoping finds a home, that's meant to be either, long running or even monthly, if I can get away with that. And in a way, I kind of see those old scripts as just my like education, or like my time in comics writing school. And if they don't make it, they don't make it. I just I want to be a working writer. I think there's something really romantic and exciting to me about that, about being able to kind of the magic to me of books like what came out of Vertigo. I mean, I've been so lucky to meet a lot of these characters, and got to talk to Brian Azzarello recently, and we're just kind of like chatting around Comic-Con about the idea of a monthly book, which is so rare outside of superhero books right now. And he said the magic of those books was that the pressure was on every month to deliver, and sometimes you just didn't deliver. Sometimes it just wasn't what you wanted it to be, but that's what it was. And then another one completely surprises you, and is a piece of art that you didn't expect to happen. So to me, I'm kind of like more interested in what's coming. I just want to keep trying to get better. I don't know, kind of corny, but like I do. I just like I think of it less about how many books I want to put out there, more like, can this be a career? Can this be something where I have enough ideas flowing and enough excitement around what I do to keep producing? Because it's so fulfilling, and in a way that I sort of mentioned music isn't, to be able to put this beginning of an idea out, this script, and then see an artist completely change my idea of what it is and make it so much better too. So it's just exciting. It's an exciting process.
Do you find that that changes the way you approach writing? Because there's already a difference in between writing a novel and writing a comic script. So what have you noticed in terms of how your thought process is being shaped as you come to write more and more comics?
I think the reason, and when Phil Jimenez, who I mentioned, when he suggested I write, it wasn't necessarily for comics. It was like he's like, I know you want to be a writer. What is it that you want to do? What is it you want to try? And I wasn't really sure. And the more we talked about it, and I wanted to do it all, and I still
Yeah.
want to do it all. And I have a half of a probably not very good novel I've put together, but like the idea of something that's so structured really attracts me to
Mhm.
comics. I'm a Virgo. I'm a very organized mind. Even when I'm chaotic, I get frustrated that I want things to be more organized. I love the idea that it's almost like a math problem, putting together a 24 or a 44 page book is um, is a puzzle, and I really
Mhm.
like that puzzle. And you're not even talking about just 24 pages, you're talking about 5 to 6 panels per page. How do I tell this story? How does it feel natural in a way when writing to that kind of math is so unnatural? The idea that page flips have to matter and it has to feel organic, but you also have to stretch a story out in the right way that that the reader feels that it's not completely mocked up on a spreadsheet, which is actually what I do. So
Mhm.
I don't know if that's unusual, but it's the way it's the way it works for me. So yeah, I think comics in particular were really excited, especially as a start for me because it's so organized and you have to be organized to do it. I'm really impressed with people that are less organized. Some people they say they just kind of write and see what happens in comics, and I'm like, how are
Mhm.
you not like halfway through your story on page 23? I don't know that without some kind of organization. So, yeah, it's fun. It's mathy. I'm a nerd.
So is that the part of the creation process that excites you the most, just figuring out the puzzle?
It's all exciting. I know that sounds corny too, but like when I first come up with an idea, I'm taking all these notes. I'm walking and suddenly this thing happens and it's just kind of on my mind. And then I'll dig into books that kind of like, talk about some of the themes, and I read those books and those books excite me, or I'll read other
Mhm.
comics that kind of like are in those kinds of worlds. But then when I'm structuring it, I love structuring it. Now,
Mhm.
I will say when I have to actually sit down and write, I hate having to sit down and write, but I do love it when I do it because it never turns out to be what I expect. And like you said, these little moments of sort of like Easter eggs I put in even for myself
Mhm.
are things that make it fun for me. And I'm like, I wonder if this one person will realize I put that one little thing in there. And that kind
Mhm.
of excites me about that too. So yeah, I'm a nerd. I love it all right now. I mean, if you would ask me the same about music 20 years ago, I would say the whole thing is exciting. And now I'm just like, no, I'd much rather be in the studio than being on tour and this and that. There's things that I know that I like and I don't like, but it's all fresh for me. So I recommend everyone have a chance to do something that's completely fresh later in their life because it is super exciting.
Mhm. Well, because there are so many things you like about it, what's the part of the process you dislike?
As I said, it's the sitting down. I think I'm trying to think. I'll butcher who this was. If I try to remember, but it's a quote that basically says, "I don't like writing, I like having written."
Mm.
I don't
Yeah.
like the work that it takes to do it, even though relatively speaking, there are much harder jobs in the world. But I always love when I'm done and I feel so accomplished. But the idea of sitting down and making myself do it when it's kind of like the reason I don't like touring as much as I like being in the studio because everything is new in the studio and you
Mhm.
go on tour and you kind of play the same things over and over. When I sit down and write, it's already an idea I've already gotten excited about, and I'm kind of
Mhm.
thinking, no, I'd rather just sit around and think about like new things and how I make it new. So it's a bit frustrating for me sometimes, but I don't think I'm alone in dreading sometimes the sitting down and blocking out
Mhm.
hours away from my phone to write
Yeah.
something.
What was something new you discovered while working on Warm Fusion?
Well, I hope I discovered this. I really wanted to do something after 2 books that I said were kind of heady and things I wanted to feel a little bit literary to maybe kind of prove myself in comics, is to try to do something that, had less words, maybe not true on the issue that you read, but it does get a little, I mean, it's less words for me, and then it gets a little bit more visual. And I wanted to try to do something that really builds up into something that has action and is very visual, because I know comics do that well. It's just not the way my brain thinks as someone that kind of grew up reading as much prose as I did.
Mhm.
I did comics and reading the heady comics that I read. I'd love to do something that feels a little more Hollywood and a little more, I would say action based, but I don't know if that's really the word I'm looking for. There's definitely going to be a lot more action coming in this book, but it's something even just about relying on visuals, relying on an artist to have fun and not worry about what my words are covering up
Mhm.
all the time.
So in terms of scripting that out, did that mean that you gave them, like, more instruction or less? Like, more, like, freedom to play? Like, what did that look like?
Um, well, from the way I sort of understand comic and writer and artist relationships, is that sometimes the direction over time gets less, not because there's less words on the page, but just because you have a sort of synergy, or you have a
Yeah.
language that you know how to communicate. And so this is a new relationship with Alberto Ponticelli,
Mhm.
who's the artist on this. But I love what he does so much. I immediately saw that he kind of like got it. Um, and I mean, I shouldn't even say got it, because it sounds like I'm the expert on this story. It's like he almost like took it even further and was like, "Oh, I know what we could do, and I know that, like, half your references are amazing, but here's another half of I can
Mhm.
throw in of other references and cool things that you should watch and we should add to it." So
Mhm.
my scripts have become uh or got less wordy, which worried me a little bit. But then I was like, oh no, I'm just actually only giving him the information that he needs and not boring him with all the like sometimes I worry. I'm just like, oh, but what if the staircase is on the left side, and then something happens later and it has it looks wrong and something's backwards, and I'm like, you know what? No, he knows what to
Mhm.
do. And just kind of giving him the basics, and that's been really fun. So I think it's developed, like those scripts have developed into more minimal things for multiple reasons. Sorry, sorry, I'm going to bore you again with one
No,
more thing.
go for it.
I'm so into the idea of how comic scripts look, because
Mhm.
it's mysterious to a lot of people, even for a lot of comics writers, is that screenplays, you can go find them online. They're
Mhm.
public sometimes, but like because they're meant for a whole crew of people, and they're meant as these sort of like pieces of art that will maybe end up hardback bound one day.
Mhm.
Comic scripts are meant for one person. No one ever has to see those again aside from that one person. There's not even someone that's going to remake your comic and draw it again from your script. It's gone. It's thrown out. Like the
Mhm.
work that matters is that final comic itself. But I still have this romantic idea of the comic script, and maybe one day someone will be interested in what that script looks like, the way you might look at an Alan Moore script and be like, wow, there's so much detail in here, and maybe some things
Mhm.
make it into the book, but you get more information about what he wanted to say. So I'm actually like way too serious about my script, and they're probably too long, and I don't know, I like doing it because it's some kind of like, I like this archival idea. I like this idea of, this is what I wanted to do, even if it didn't look like that. Maybe one day one person will be interested in like what
Mhm.
I look like.
No,
Boring
I'm
stuff.
I'm so glad you said that, because there is a bit of a mystery surrounding comics a little bit in terms of how they're made. It's like some information you can find, like interviews with people and that kind of thing, but lots of the behind the scenes process, unless a work gets really big and then it gets some nice hardbound something and then all the notes are in the back, you don't get to see that kind of thing. So I think I
And even at best, maybe one issue in the back. I don't think
yes.
it's full script, like an entire script for a series. Yeah,
Mhm.
you're right.
No, and, like, that's, like, they did this release, it's behind me over there, of, Get Freebies, and it's, like, it was so interesting to see all of that history, and I think that kind of stuff is important, because I feel like that it can make it a little intimidating, I think, for some people getting into comics, because there is, like, well, how do you like, what does it look like? Like, what is it? Like, did you feel that at all?
Well, and that was the magic I got with Phil,
Mhm,
was being able to say, like, when you were making Invisibles, what did those scripts look like? What kind of direction did you get? What was the process? Because it's so opaque, we don't really see it. Um, one of the most inspiring things for me was, sometimes you have to wait for the hardback, but there are, there's the Invisibles volumes, right? So in the back, they put some really cool stuff. And I always love seeing great back matter in those books. And it'll be maybe a few pages of script, which is cool to see, but then also like Grant's pitch to DC about what the dream of Invisibles really was. And this thing is so inspiring. It's like the entire philosophy of a book with like so much passion poured onto a few pages of writing. And I think that kind of stuff, again, like we wouldn't ever see it otherwise. So it's so exciting to be able to dig. And there, fortunately now there are ways to dig that people didn't have before.
And I feel like people are more interested also in archiving it, which is important because you don't want to lose that kind of information and that history. That terrifies me.
Phil, I think, said he was starting in digital at one point, and he may have had some of the original art for some of these books on CD-ROMs, and they were just like lying around his house, and he may have been missing one. Like it was like the only copy of like the original stuff, and it's like, no, and that's I guess maybe one of the downfalls of independent publishers opening and closing and stuff like that. Obviously, there's so many advantages, but you have a big company like DC or Marvel, I imagine they have the resources a bit more to like put together an archive of everything.
One would hope.
You would hope, exactly. Well, it's funny, like Universal, who was my band's label for years, they at a certain point wanted to make sure they had all of our stuff and have our files and this and that, but they had an archive that famously like got like set on fire, and there was like half the stuff was missing, and I think they lost some of our stuff and all that. So it's like if you're not good at doing this yourself, it might just disappear forever, but maybe that's what makes it exciting too.
How do you find the different relationship between the reception of your work? Because you were talking earlier about how like when you go out and you perform, like there's that immediacy. So what's it like to receive this different, more, I guess, down the field type of feedback where you might even be working on, something entirely different? Because I know how long comics can take sometimes to come out of the pipeline from like the inception.
It's cool to see that. I just think I'm used to now in the comics world, at least, going to people I trust who aren't going to hopefully not bullshit me. And I don't know if I can say that word on this.
You can go for it.
Yeah, it's like people that are going to tell me the truth about what I'm doing, and I rely more on that than getting that direct feedback. I almost feel like maybe the direct feedback that I might be expecting is still down the line on everything I've written, or maybe I'll just get less. But kind of doing interviews and podcasts like this is like that's kind of what's exciting to me, because it is one of the only times I hear people ask me questions about specific things that I didn't even know if they'd sort of pick up on. So it's a little bit more like kind of like I'm floating out there hoping, fingers crossed that people like these books. But Warm Fusion, it's funny, it comes out next week on Wednesday the 11th. We can mention that. I don't know when this airs, but December 11th.
I'm gonna aim it for the same time.
Yeah, okay, cool. So like it'll be the first physical book that I've even had out, because my first two comicsology books were digital only and have future coming. Apparently that's Mad Cave for those first two books on comicsology, which is super exciting. But I haven't even experienced that yet. I haven't even been in physical signings with the book to kind of talk to people.
I was gonna ask, like, do you have one yet? Have you gotten to hold it? Or
no? And I'm bummed because I have a couple pictures of people being like, I got my comps and like here they are and look how cool this is, and I'm just sitting by the door. Nothing yet. It's coming.
No, they say that that's a very different, experience actually physically holding it, because there is something about the tangible item that is different than the digital experience. Like they both have their benefits. There's pros and cons to both, but there is something that's very special about that physical version.
Yeah, as a person that travels a lot, I love digital books. But being able to have the physicals, there's probably, there's nothing like it. And I am really excited to hold that in my hand. What I don't like about it is that I'm going to want to open it up and look, and I'm probably going to see a mistake that I made somewhere or other. I really don't like, same with music, I just don't like looking back once it's out into the world. I mean, maybe way later, it's interesting, but I know I'll find something that I should have done differently. But I'm like, I'm fine with it if I don't open it up. I'm like, oh, this is exciting. And if you see a typo, just don't tell me.
Don't tell you.
Yeah, or plot holes or like a million other things that could go wrong. Yeah.
So, since you're someone that likes to, look forward to the next thing, like how does that impact your relationship with your past work?
I am just like that person that's always kind of looking forward until it's time to take a little look back. And it's funny with my band looking back at a 20-year anniversary of our first record. It almost feels like that's the minimum amount of time I want to
Yeah.
take. I sort of like look back and think about those moments, which is nice to do with some distance. But no, for me, I want to keep doing really different things. I
Mhm.
want to keep putting out books, even though they're all going to be genre to some degree. I want to keep trying new ideas
Mhm.
and new approaches, because that's what keeps it exciting for me
Mhm.
as well. I remember, and sorry to keep bringing it back to the band, but it is, sort of, but part of a big part of my life is we looked at our first album as the experience of kind of having a bunch of your favorite radio stations in your, like in your car, and just
Mhm.
flipping through them and listening to like all these different genres and different radio stations, different emotions and attitudes. And that's kind of how I want to see comics as well, is like,
Mhm.
oh, like this, if this is seen as like a kind of body horror book, like great, my next one will just probably have nothing to do with that.
Mhm.
Um and that's probably the only way it sort of informs it.
Mhm.
Um,
So do you want them to be very different from each other then? Like, do you wanna be someone who, like, people don't know what you're gonna do next type
I,
thing?
I do. I think that's super exciting, but I also want to get to the point, which I have been lucky enough to hear from certain people, is like they say they read the next thing and they're like, oh, it's so you. Like the writing is so you. And I really appreciate that people can
Pick up on your
differentiate.
voice?
Yeah, pick up on my voice. Exactly. So I always want it to feel like my voice. I'm probably never gonna get out of being kind of a wordy writer and wanting to put a lot in there again that like I said, like gives it legs.
Mhm.
I think it's so important to try to make work that isn't just there as a pitch for a movie,
Mhm.
or is there for read once and throw it on a pile. Like I do want people to be able to go back to what I'm doing and find more in there. So I think that's always going to be consistent, but I want to keep trying really different things.
Mhm. Because Worm Fusion is playing a lot in some interesting spaces in terms of, like the fetishism that is involved in some aspects of the book. Like, how did you find that balance? Because you did say that you wanted it to feel empowering. So, because Distiller does allow you to have a bit more of adult content in terms of its visuals. So, how did you find that line?
I will say that was the hardest part of this book. The idea of being empathic, being sensitive, um, and having a lead who in my um, sort of reading, understanding of the way story works, trying to really get at the heart of the way a great story is constructed. You need a hero that is going to suffer so that they can be heroic, and that
Mhm.
to put the female character, who is also a person who deals with additional trauma,
Mhm.
um, in these traumatic situations, felt very tricky for me. And it was something I wanted to be really sensitive about, but also not be afraid of.
Mhm.
So that said, I started this book in early stages where Vin was actually one of the detectives, and my editor Will Dennis uh, told me to throw that script out the window, and he just was like, you're not this doesn't go hard enough. And
Mhm.
I kind of realized I mean, I definitely realized he was right, and I decided to sort of approach some of these issues from the standpoint of a victim in this book who was also going to be heroic in many ways. So um yes, it's very difficult, but I want to give her a chance to,
Mhm.
and I hopefully people give her a chance to overcome this
Mhm.
stuff she's dealing with. And I think everyone in the book is dealing with some kind of trauma in some way. I think the book is less about a person dealing with trauma than an entire world, an entire culture that
Yeah,
is.
because on the news when they're riding on the train, there's a mention of, collective trauma and the way that that manifests itself in society. Is that something that you feel that you see around you currently?
Oh, absolutely. I think we lived through a pandemic. We lived through fraught political times. We lived through the history of a country that hasn't always been kind, to say the least, to the people that live there. So I think this, to me, like I said, I'm not writing about the future as much as I'm writing about the way I see the
Mhm.
present, kind of like embellished
Mhm.
or pushed further. So I'm super interested in the idea of not just a world that is surrounded with trauma, but also a world that's surrounded with a certain kind of toxicity, whether that's environmental toxicity or psychological toxicity. The media that we consume, everything that we consume, from the food to the media, it's
Mhm.
consumption of stuff that may be toxic in certain ways. And what I find interesting about the fetishization of this trauma in this book is that I
Mhm.
think what we need to realize is that so many people have these imprints from so early on, and that their desires are sort of built from, that may not come from a place that is completely positive, or that is a place that might be steeped in trauma, but those are still desires, and those are still there's that sort of paradox of desire, right? It's like things
Mhm.
that we may feel familiar to us from our past that weren't necessarily good for us then, but that we desire because they're familiar now.
Mhm.
So, so it's definitely a complicated issue. I wanted to be able to kind of dive in, and hopefully, I'm going to get away with that without too much.
Was that part of why you chose the Princess Snow White to be her, like, avatar, basically?
Yeah, I was reading a lot about story, as I mentioned. I do read a lot about story. I'm fascinated by the sociology of story, and even
Mm.
the what's kind of known as like the like narratology, like the science of story, and why we
Mhm.
tell stories and why we're affected by story. And there's a really interesting thing that came up in a book of sort of the history of story plot, that was the cursed woman running into the woods, and it was a really rare plot form that's
Mhm.
only seen in a few examples. Snow White was one, and Sleeping Beauty was one as well. As a curse, they a cursed woman who runs into the woods and decides she's so unable to deal with the world that she has run into that she falls asleep to
Mhm.
escape it. And that, to me, was really evocative and something I wanted to build not just into the character, but into the story. The idea of these traumatic places that we go to, it could be New York City, where we, as I mentioned before,
Mhm.
as a young, as a person going to college there when I was, 19 or 20, and escaping to this place that in a way is so overwhelming that you almost create this fantasy that you want to create there to
Mhm.
deal with the the overwhelmingness and the sort of harshness of that environment. So yeah, sorry, there's no question you can ask that I'm not gonna go on
No,
forever.
that's fine.
Super astute, and I appreciate you asking about that. Yeah, I think it's a really important element of this book, not just her sort of cosplay in the book, but
Mhm.
the idea of that story, and the archaic idea of a story where every time a prince comes to save that woman.
Mhm. How do you balance, like, because when you're talking about that, because it is a very common, element of fairy tales that there's that kind of savior that ends up coming, but how do you find a way to, I guess, counterbalance that without coming across as, I suppose, trite?
Well, you'll definitely have to finish the book first, and you'll see. But I think I'm really knocking the idea. I think
Mhm.
I really, as I said, I think it's an archaic idea. I think there are a lot of stories embedded in our culture that have a lot of truth to them, but there are also a
Mhm.
lot of stories embedded in our culture that are stuck um, in sort of misguided norms that
Mhm.
that we do have the power to break out of. So to me,
Mhm.
this is a bit about, it's as much a fairy tale as about the idea of someone breaking out of a cycle of sort of the fairy tale that we all expect to happen
Mhm.
to us. And New York to me is really like a place where people go in particular to break out of that fairy tale. I know where I came from, there are a lot of people, you know, I grew up in Kentucky, love it in a lot of ways. There are people that feel that there's a certain way that they have to live there, a certain way they have to raise families and be and
Mhm.
live up to a certain standard. New York was always that escape from that. You don't have to live by those rules. And I think that was kind of like the perfect setting for this, and thematically where I want to go, where we don't have to believe in those fairy tales anymore.
I know you were talking about, consuming a lot of, more literary type fare, but also surrealist fare, like, because Burroughs is incredibly, surrealist in some of those works. Like,
Yeah.
do you find that that impacts how you, like, put that into your work?
Yeah, that's great. I think you know, I was uh this is not the most original idea, but I was going back to Ballard as well, who I've had
Mhm.
kind of like a mixed relationship with, but wanted to really kind of rediscover what it is that people loved about Ballard, because some of it can be very that's J.G. Ballard for people that
Yeah.
necessarily read him, but he's so referenced, he's so heavily referenced.
Mhm.
Definitely a touchstone for Cronenberg, who actually
Mhm.
adapted Crash, is one of his
Yes.
books. If not maybe one more, but I think maybe that just that one. But I went back to Ballard and realized I think the real pioneering work he did was the Atrocity Exhibition, which is a
Mhm.
completely abstract kind of microfiction, little paragraphs about moments in culture. It's really subversive. It's really bizarre. I don't even
Mhm.
know what to make of it, but I went back to that, and what I realized is, like, for one, it was super inspiring.
Mhm.
For some of the specifics, and Atrocity is where we is the brothel
Mhm.
where Vin works in the book, but also just the idea that some of this more surreal and abstract writing is almost a tool to unearth things from your mind. It's like
Mhm.
free association, and just hearing this like flood of ideas instead of watching someone take reading a linear plot can be inspiring in some
Mhm.
ways, but sometimes there's not enough like
Mhm.
ammunition there to really get the mind going. So like I love the idea of going to some of the surrealist writing and the choppy free association kind of work to get my mind
Mhm.
going. I had a lot of trouble writing this book, just uh structure wise, plot wise,
Mhm.
because it has a lot of disparate elements that have to come together,
Yeah.
and that isn't my skill. My skill, I think, is in putting words together, hopefully at least
Mhm.
that. But so I really struggled with this, and just one of my ways to break out of that was to read a lot of things that sort of broke me out of certain patterns, and then just seeing if a new idea worked and could be able to be fit in.
Mhm. 'Cause I noticed some of that at the end of issue 1, especially when, like, the kind of 3, like, moments blend together. It's a kind of synergistic ending as the hook for the next issue. It's really interesting you mentioned Ballard because one of the things I was thinking of when I was reading it is, The Drowned World just a little bit in terms of how a lot of some of the devastation is more mentioned in passing. It's just kind of part of the environment that they're living in, like when they're at the cafe with the butterflies that they can just reach through because they're not even real anymore. So it's just,
I love that.
it's
Yeah, I think there's an almost like a nihilism to the point of complete disassociation with some of that Ballard work that I really like. And again, that idea of that toxicity, which the Drowned World
Mhm.
is sort of about, that is like we will adapt. Now,
Mhm.
where humanity goes, or where how this affects our psychology, is a whole nother story, but
Mhm.
or is a whole nother aspect. But we do endure through these changes,
Mhm.
and I think you're right. Absolutely. I had this, I was thinking it was so funny. I was obsessed with that Madonna Ray of Light album for
Mhm.
years. I don't know if you ever listened to that record, but it's kind of a classic to me. It's probably
Mhm.
before your time. And it starts off with the song Drowned World. And I didn't really think much about it. I think it's partially an instrumental. So I was in William Orbit's studio, which I was lucky enough to be, and he had this big bookshelf there, and this is years later, and Drowned World by Ballard was on the bookshelf, and I'm like, oh, of course they were sitting here probably, and Madonna picked up this book or whatever. But the reason people love Ballard in a certain way is partially that even though maybe you can't name one specific book that kind of changed everything, there are so much minutia that kind of is out there, these ideas that are kind of floating around that have influenced our culture so heavily. And I think he's one of those. He's one of those that he's embedded in our culture and people don't even realize it.
I think that happens with a lot of different works because you're working through it in a warm fusion with fairy tales, but it happens all the time, this kind of interplay. Because you mentioned Clive Barker earlier, and then that made me think about, Books of Blood. One of the stories in there is there's a line in that in the Nine Inch Nails album, the song Sin and all of those things. It's they're all just kind of everything's interconnected with each
almost
other.
You're so right. And I'm a big Nine Inch Nails fan. I remember I've heard the beginning of Downward Spiral a million times, and I watched THX 1138 and I heard that sample, and I'm like, I can't believe I've heard this so many times and had no idea that was a sample from a film that's been around forever. So, I think in a way, I know this again might sound a little corny, but it's like nerds speaking to each other in another language. It's these little references that are just put there for people that might care. And I think that's kind of what I've always loved. I've never been a mainstream consumer of things. I've always wanted to look into the back of the bargain bin to find something that no one else wanted, or find those books that no one else has really read. And it's just that living that kind of life to me used to be a little bit more fetishized in a way, this kind of person that's always finding the things that no one else knew. And everything's so accessible now that it is nice to have those little things that are just kind of thrown in there that you're like, oh, it is that reference to that thing that you realize 5 years later when you find that cool book. So.
No, it's because there's so much more access and visibility in terms of the way people perform subcultures. I think there is an assumption sometimes that the true subcultural elements are no longer there, but they are. It's just you just need to access them in different ways, basically.
Absolutely. And getting back to the theme, one of the themes of this book is that idea of that access kind of being so much overstimulation that we're almost numb to what's new, what's exciting, what is actually transgressive when you've seen everything already, when you have access to literally everything you could ever want in the world. And I think this book is about people kind of searching for that thing, that one thing that maybe no one's ever experienced before, no one's ever found before. But as we talk about story, there is nothing new. It's all the same fairy tale told over and over in different ways.
People say that, but I don't know. I guess it's the idealist in me. I'm like, that can't be true.
You think we have new fairy tales coming?
There's something new that we just don't know about it yet because it's new. So
I think you're right. It's just that to get a bit nerdy here, it is the dilemma of living in the postmodern world is even when it's new, we can usually point to something in the past that maybe have set
it could
that
be
up.
Connected,
Exactly. But yeah, that's the good and the bad, because the access to me is what I always wished for growing up. I just, I hated that, there was music out there that I didn't really know where to find, or, there was stuff that, people talked about that I didn't know where to get it. Now it's all there. So it's a great time to be an excited consumer of really cool stuff. But now the challenge is how to find it, right? How to curate what it is.
Exactly. How to figure out what you want. And also, if you're a creator, where to find the best outlets for what you're trying to create, because there's also now different things that cater to, do you find that when you're pitching things, that's something you consider? There are certain companies oh, this would be good for this, or this would be good for this type of story type thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of pitching, we still live in a world where people love a comparison. So it's still the first thing they want to see is, this meets this, and just some kind of reference for that person to get their head around. And I understand why that is, but for the most part, for me, I'm still running from those. Like, I'm running
Yeah.
from those references that feel obvious,
Mhm.
and jumping into the references that I feel like maybe haven't been pulled
Mhm.
as much. But I don't know. It's futile. It's all. I do think it's all related. I think everything is out there. Like, everything I've consumed is in these books to some degree,
Mhm.
whether I like it or not. I don't want to
Well,
reference Star Wars because everyone does, but I'm sure it's in there.
well, now when people check this out, they're gonna have to go look and see if they can find a Star
What's
Wars
the lightsaber? What's the lightsaber? Exactly. Exactly.
Well, thank you so much for taking some time to chat about it. This was a great conversation. It was really interesting. Warm Fusion is very interesting. And I'm sure that people, when they go and check it out, which I'll have links and everything down below for where they can get it, will enjoy it. So, again, thank you so much. Is there anything that you want to tell the people before we head out?
Well, this is part one of three,
Hmm.
as the distillery format does. So it's December 11th. We have 2 issues coming out in the early new year, and then the collection. And I'm super
Hmm.
excited to put this out into the world. Distillery's been amazing, letting me kind of go where I want to go, and I think everyone will enjoy this book. And
Hmm.
thank you so much for a super thoughtful conversation, and picking up on some of the stuff I was hoping people would. So I
No,
appreciate it.
thank you. It's good to nerd out. So.
Nerd out. I love it. Let's nerd out again.
Thanks so much to everyone who made it to the end. Please be sure to check out Warm Fusion. If you're enjoying these interviews, I have a whole playlist for you to check out. As always, there will be more videos coming soon. Until then, please do all the YouTube things, like, share, comment, subscribe, hit the bell notification, and I'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.